I'm David Fodrea, and I did my presentation on parenting styles and how they affect trauma within families. So before looking up the research on this topic, it's important to know what parenting styles are and what each one looks like. This graphic I found does a good job of explaining the 4 parenting styles in simplest terms. As you can see, there are 2 scales, the acceptance scale and the demanding or boundaries scale. If a parent has low acceptance and low boundaries, for example, they would fall under the neglectful parenting style. A parent who has high acceptance and low boundaries is permissive. If they have high boundaries and low acceptance, they are authoritarian. And if they have both high acceptance and high boundaries, they are authoritative. Now here are a couple more graphics to illustrate what they look like exactly. But in psychology, these parenting styles have been studied pretty thoroughly, and they have even been linked to things like physical health, crime activity, and academic success. For example, a child who has an authoritarian parent is much more likely to be involved in crime than a child who has an authoritative parent. And a child with permissive parents is much more likely to have physical health issues than a child with authoritative parents. Basically, parenting styles are a big predicting factor for a lot of things in a child's life. But what does this have to do with trauma? Well, as it turns out, we know that traumatic events can affect the way children view their parents. One study found that children are more likely to view their parents as strict and hostile after a traumatic event. These are all traits that are associated with authoritarian parenting styles, which begs the question, does trauma facilitate or cause authoritarian parenting? Or does it just make children feel that way? And how can we tell? But this particular article seems to suggest that trauma may cause a change in parenting strategies. However, it mentions that it may work the other way as well. That is to say that perhaps certain parenting styles lead to greater chance of a child experiencing trauma. Now, generational trauma fits this description pretty well. Essentially, a parenting strategy that leads to trauma passing down to your children. And although generational trauma is well studied and understood, the mechanisms through which it passes from parent to child are still widely unknown. Another study found that mothers who had experienced interpersonal trauma were much more likely to have an authoritarian parenting style. And more specifically, they were more likely to use verbal hostility, physical coercion, and have low nurturance. Out of these 3 traits, it was found that verbal hostility was the strongest predictor of trauma. In this article, they concluded that the authoritarian parenting style could serve as a major intergenerational pathway of trauma between mothers and children, because authoritarian parents are more verbally hostile. Now, this kind of means that there is a positive feedback loop of trauma, so to speak. Trauma causes parents to be authoritarian, yet being authoritarian causes trauma for their children, and so on. It's a cycle we've all heard of before, but until now, we haven't really thought about some of the causes and mechanisms of generational trauma. But there are a few takeaways from this research. The first and foremost is to be aware of the problem, so that you can seek professional help when needed. But the next is that even if your parents were authoritarian, you are not destined to follow suit. These studies that I've mentioned are only talking about statistical averages and do not represent the population as a whole. It's important to know about the issue so that you can be the one who breaks the parental or generational trauma cycle. And finally, even though we know a lot about trauma and parenting styles, we haven't done a lot of research on how they are related. There are so many questions that have not been explored. Like, do neglectful and permissive parenting styles have a similar effect on trauma? And if not, are they related to other kinds of trauma? Or is it just authoritarian parents that see this problem? Are there any forms of trauma that are correlated with authoritative parenting, which is considered to be the healthiest or the best kind of parenting? And it would also just be nice to have some more data on this subject so that we can have a deeper understanding of the likelihoods and percentages and chances associated with parenting and trauma. So in conclusion, this is certainly a subject worth researching, and I hope to see more studies done on it in the future. Thank you.